Welcome to Grappling with Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making. Help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I'd like to welcome my guests for today. With me is Catherine Fitzgerald, who is a speaker, writer, certified coach, and founder of Brass Tacks with Heart Executive Coaching. She works with founders and their leaders as they navigate the choppy waters of aligning people, performance, and profits. Steve Smith is president of Great Castle Partners Incorporated, group chair at Vistage Worldwide Incorporated, and business builder of cloud-based supply chain solutions for distribution and specialty retail industries. And Kimi Hirotsu Ziemski is founder of KSP Partnership, giving project management and project leadership courses and workshops to improve and to improve team dynamics and communications. Welcome to communications. Thank you all for being with me now. And here is our scenario for today. One of the underlying principles of ethics is that trust forms the foundation of successful relationships and healthy communities. This simple idea explains why team building exercises have become so popular among HR departments. What it doesn't explain is why these exercises are so hated among employees. Unfortunately, some of these activities seem designed to sow discord rather than unity. One reported exercise instructed each member to take a swig of soda and then spit it into another member's mouth. Strangely enough, some employees refused to participate. Another activity required each person to go around the room and tell everyone else what they didn't like about them. One participant described the result as cascades of tears and mutual loathing. And just this past August, an employee was left behind by coworkers hiking in the Colorado mountains and spent the night exposed to high winds and freezing rain before rescue teams found him the next morning. We all get wacky ideas from time to time. But how do we explain the lack of a vetting process, competent decision-making, and executive accountability that all have to coalesce to produce these kinds of horror stories? And how do we go about fixing a problem that's so obvious that it shouldn't be a problem in the first place? The floor is open.
Well, since I'm new, I'll let the others jump in first.
I don't know about YouTube, but it reminded me that somebody had been seeing far too many Survivor.
Yeah, I had the same thought. I wondered if there was any certification or training for the leaders of this extravaganza. I was really horrified. I belong to a community of coaches, and I shared this as, like, let's talk about it. And I got such outrage that they were like, this is throwing our profession into, the gray area for sure, but somebody said, is it really gray? It seems pretty black and white to us. And in my mind, having been an employee, but also been a leader and now a coach, I can say that, I can't imagine what they were thinking. There wasn't a lot of thought, I don't think.
Well, that's sort of the remarkable thing, isn't it? That they must have really thought this was going to work.
Yeah.
It's a great point. Sometimes I wonder if some of this is sort of shock therapy. I had a software company for 22 years. Yonason, before I sold it. And I think the thing that I always found interesting is team building is something that it should be just like breathing. If you create a great culture, then team building just sort of naturally happens if you've got a really good culture and you promote things like collaboration. So, for us, it was just sort of a natural occurrence, but I think maybe in larger organizations, we certainly weren't large. Perhaps people feel they have to do things with more intentionality. And then, sometimes a good idea goes awry. Next thing you know, we're trying to spit into each other's mouth, which just sounds, crazy and, giving people feedback without having some degree of compassion also doesn't feel like that's going to be a winning formula either. So I suppose those people had good intentions, or maybe they wanted to create a certain outcome, but I think team building for me has always just been kind of part of the DNA of the cultures that I've always been a part of. So it just seemed like a natural occurrence. We didn't have to do it we didn't have to force it.
No, there's a famous road paved with good intentions, right, Katie?
Here, Catherine had mentioned that empathy needs to be taught as we're significantly younger and even shorter than I am now. And that without that early teaching, it becomes that much more difficult to learn it as adults. And it seems to me that's actually an underlying theme throughout all of these disasters, was nobody thought about how the other people were going to react to this kind of thing. Somebody thinks, oh, I just love it when I hear other people's perspective about what I can work on. And so without giving any thought to whether or not anybody else would just love it, they embark on this kind of thing. And I'm sorry, but I think I would probably do something irresponsible in the leadership position and go after the team that left their colleague with no mercy. I mean, talking to
Recording in progress.
was called for, but I think that might be one of the ways, because we all did talk about, well, what do we do to prevent that? And I think gauging a little bit more closely the levels of empathy in the people who are making that decision and making that part of their consideration process might help a little.
You remind me of an article I read some time ago. I actually put it in one of my books about culture, that they took very young children. They may have been 2 or 3 or 4, I can't remember, and they gave them they put candies on the table, and they had the choice to either eat the candies themselves or feed them to, I think it was sock bucket puppets or something like that. And they video them. And then they use computer software to analyze their facial expressions. And they found that these little kids looked happier when they were feeding the puppets than they were when they were eating the chocolate themselves. So it's what, you mentioned the conversation we were having before we got started about empathy having to be learned. It seems to be more complicated than that. It's that empathy gets unlearned and then has to be relearned. Although, practically speaking, I'm not sure it matters, because we still need a mechanism in place that's going to guide us in fostering and developing those empathetic responses.
I would agree. It's interesting to me that, for years I'm surrounded by teachers, my mother, my sister, and I think that they have expressed more than once that what used to happen in the home is now being expected to be taught in the classroom. And now I feel like in California, especially, we've kind of gone to the next level, and now we're basically putting it on people's bosses, because we're not, the teachers are so hamstrung in their classrooms these days. There is no, the classroom management system, as I knew it and you knew it as children, does not exist now. And so now they get into the workplace, and they have no skills to manage what is happening. And, in the coaching arena or the consulting, which I do a little bit of both, there's often a dialogue, and I try really hard to facilitate empathy through my dialogue, because we have a tendency to make up the story and the facts that the other person comes to the table with, so that our conversations are directed at what we already have decided they feel, think, and will, express, and instead of being open. And I think that, this team engagement in a forced environment gives, is kind of fueled by that need to get more out of your people. And that also creates a resentment and an undercurrent. And instead of assuming that everybody comes to the office to do their best work, but may or may not have all the tools in their toolbox to do their best work, and help them to, get what they need to move forward and elevate their contribution, we assume stupidity or poor choices or poor priorities or whatever it is. And we do that with each other in coworker situations, but we also do that as supervisors looking at our team. And I think that it's going to take a real transformation in our workplace and in our schools to understand the whole emotional intelligence aspect of relationship, and how do we grow a productive relationship in a work environment, in homes. I mean, we see it all over our world. Driving down the street, someone cuts you off. We assume that they intended it, not that they were human and maybe didn't see the person behind them or beside them. That's just the facts.
No, that really goes back to a conversation, Kimi, that you and I had a long time ago, when we said that it's a mistake to call these soft skills. And I've often quoted you as calling them
Power skills.
power skills. I love that. Because really, that's where the power of leadership comes from.
So, because Steve had mentioned that if you build the appropriate culture, modeling exactly what Catherine was talking about, and keeping in mind what Jonathan so very kindly mentioned, these are the skills that have the power to make or break the organizational culture, as long as you are keeping aware of it. And Stephen, that sounds an awful lot like that's what you were doing.
Yeah, I certainly didn't grow up in a family of teachers and coaches. My brother is a coach of, does leadership coaching. As you know, I call myself the accidental Vistage chair and coach. I sold my business to a public company and was planning to retire, and they said, well, I was in my Vistage group, and the chair said, I'm leaving, so you need something to do, so why don't you take over as chair? So I became an accidental chair and coach, and so I've had a lot of fun. It's a great analog for me. But Kimi, to get back to your point, I've always told people the secret sauce of my previous business was culture. It wasn't building great products, it was culture. If you have a great culture and you really love people, then good things happen. It's sort of like raising kids, and I have a teenager at home. Just give them a lot of love, and they'll end up doing the right thing as opposed to doing the wrong thing. So I lean into comments like empathy and showing goodwill to others. That was sort of the the DNA of our business, and so I sort of approach my chair practice the same way. But I certainly understand, Catherine. Do you go by Catherine?
I do.
Yeah. So one thing I have noticed, in my Vistage practice, I would say the struggle that I see the business owners having in some of the C-level suite is that there's this sort of random, I wouldn't say random, actually, a condemnation of Gen Z and millennials. They don't know anything. They don't want, all of the cliche comments that you hear. And it's just that they grew up differently. I am sort of, classically a boomer Gen Xer. And so we just grew up differently. And so they have a different, frame or refrain, if you want to call it. And so it's really getting people to, as you would say, Catherine, step back, not come from judgment, and understand the life path that they're on, because their life path is very different. I look at my daughter's school, high school, it's just, I mean, I grew up in Hawaii, you know, like I grew up so different than everyone else to begin with, but, you know, so, but
Yes.
I look at, you know, how Mirabella grows up, and it's just, it's completely different. They have to juggle all this technology and learning. We didn't have to do any of that stuff. You know, we just worried about having shoes.
Mhm. And being that junior high girl who had the mean girls, you know, that you,
Oh yeah,
that,
totally.
the reality of it on your phone that you carry
Yeah.
with you 24/7, and
Yeah.
their ability to comment 24/7, there's no escape from it. And yeah, I
Yeah.
have a lot of empathy for kids today.
There's
Yeah.
a lot piling on and,
Well, and the damage caused by COVID, you can't even
Yeah.
calculate that.
Oh
Mhm.
yeah, exactly. The academic damage, not to mention social,
Yeah, I
psychosocial.
mean, academic
Yeah.
can make up, but you know, I was saying before we went on that I was dragged back by into teaching high school at gunpoint part-time.
You know, during COVID, we made everyone come to work, you know, after like in 2021. And I, you know, and of course I was commuting because my software company was in Des Moines. So I was commuting between San Diego and Des Moines. That's a whole nother story. But we would, you know, we had a large office, so we had a lot of social distancing, but we spent all of that time during COVID, aside from, you know, all of the protocols. All we did, honestly, is just find ways to create social context for people getting together. You know, it's sort of like, are we working? It's like, yeah, but we're here to kind of be together. And so we spent so much time just encouraging, you know, good mental health. I mean, all that was our giving you know, gifts to people. But we just, that was like a big learning for me during COVID, that I'm a, you know, because how I grew up, I'm a people person. So and we had a software company, we were already doing hybrid, but the idea of just that people want to stay at home in isolation and work, I'm like, that's just not how we're wired as humans. So we spent a lot of time figuring out how to get people together, even if it meant going outside. But, you know, when I was traveling back to Iowa frequently, even during COVID, it was like, we got to get together. We just can't sit here behind our Zoom. So I want to let you know I have huge empathy for people who suffered greatly from emotional distress, because all they were doing is on. It's not natural to be on. I don't find it natural for me to be on a Zoom call 8 hours a day. Maybe Jonathan does that, but you
Well,
know,
you're raising an
I
interesting
go
point, Steve.
crazy. I don't coach.
That
I don't do any of my coaching by Zoom. It's all in person. So I just so you guys know, I do a lot of driving.
you're raising an interesting point, because you know, there seems to be a fair amount of research now suggesting that people are more productive in the office, that they're happier in the office, and yet there's this tremendous resistance to going back into the office.
I don't know why. I love going. We had such a fun time. We all loved it.
Well,
I don't know.
I think
Anyway.
we're a lot of us may be outliers on this program,
Yeah.
but
oh, no, I've been working hybrid since 1983. So I can safely assume that I'm probably been doing this for longer than anybody.
Yeah, that's
And
awesome.
but I do mean hybrid, because when the organization I worked for first did that, they specifically chose people who, frankly, if they were in the office anyway, they weren't in front of the client. And if they weren't in front of the client, that meant they weren't really doing their job.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
So the choice who first went hybrid was done very deliberately.
Yeah.
And I personally really liked not having to drive all the way from Clayton to Palo Alto. It was like a 60-mile round trip in California traffic, folks. So that I could then turn around and drive from Palo Alto, where Stanford University is,
Yeah.
all the way up to Berkeley, where all my clients were.
Oh
And
geez, that's hard driving in San Francisco and South Bay. It's like,
yeah.
oh, it's literally, when I bought my car, she said, "Why is it so important for you to have a fun car?" And I said, You have no idea how much time I spend in a car looking at
That's
nothing
true.
but the
Yeah,
tailgate.
I'm not going to complain. I don't know where you guys live in California, but I'm in North County, San Diego, so my driving is, nothing compared to what you guys might have to deal with. So
Yeah, I'm in the central. It looks like we have the state covered. I'm in Fresno but I went to school at UCLA, so I lived in LA for about 5 years.
yeah.
And all three of my sons graduated from university down there, and two of them still live down there, one in Huntington Beach and one in San Diego. And when I go to visit them, I was 17 years old when I went to college, and I had my license all of about, a year and a month or something. And I drive down there now, and it's like, how did that was like the first place I really drove. And then my early career, I spent 9 years on the road,
Yeah.
doing 35 or 45,000 miles a year.
Oh, that's
Between
hard. Yeah.
Modesto and Bakersfield.
Oh my God.
Not a
Between
lot of
Modesto- oh.
scenic views there. I'll just tell you that.
I am not gonna complain. Yeah, I did a lot of driving when I was a
Listen,
kid.
folks, let's get back to the team building for a
Actually
moment.
goes
Yes.
to the differences in the generations that you two were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of the younger people, and at my age, I'm beginning to feel like everybody's a little younger, keep saying, well, Kimmy, no, this is wonderful because think of all the pollution we're not putting out into the air because we're not driving to meet everybody, for our book club or something like that. And I'm thinking, I'm sorry, but book club without munchies and chit-chatting and side conversations which you can't have. All those little dynamics and learning to navigate, conversations are going on over there, conversations are going on here, and the conversation is going over here. I hesitate to say that I'm willing to drive. I'm even willing to pay, well, so far anyway, willing to pay the gas prices. And I also understand what they're trying to say. They're saying, look, we also feel very strongly that there are some benefits to connecting like this that you folks are pretending aren't there. And I don't think maybe we've done a good enough job in saying, yeah, no, we get it. There are benefits. Absolutely. I mean, look at where we all are today, just in this panel. And so maybe it's a question of saying, well, you should understand that the benefits of being in person are always going to outweigh. Well, they're not always. And I think maybe that's part of it. It might not be a bad idea to get rid of some of our absolutes.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I totally agree. And I think, a lot of my practice is with people that are not in my area. So I do use Zoom, but getting together with them after building a relationship through Zoom is like walking into family. I mean, it's just, it feels so connected. And, a part of it is, I think, our styles and the way that we have learned to navigate the world and relationship build. And we're again comparing generations that are coming up that have come up in a totally different environment in terms of their, but I also, having been in sales, I think, and growing up, raising three boys, I was, the old school, person who would never speak for my child if we were in public. If you want that, then, use your words. And, if you would like to say something, then you say, excuse me. And then you say, use your words. And so my kids are all very extroverted and very comfortable in any environment, but that is not the case in every household. And it can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. Yeah. So, but I think as we talk about team building in an environment where culture has been, as I say, we have a culture whether you're working on it or not. And if you're not working on it, you're probably a victim of it.
And I know the old culture is what you do with intentionality, what you allow. When people have bad culture or culture they're not happy with, I say, well, what are you allowing to happen? Because it's happening by default if you're not doing it with intentionality. And I think that
Yeah.
goes over to things like teamwork. So
Exactly. And so to try to engage to fix a culture is the cart before the horse. And I think I was in a team that I was a member of years ago in my career that had gone really south. And they brought in a group from the Midwest, actually, who helped us learn how to create culture again in a more in a forgiveness-based relationship with each other. And it was huge that, it was like 3 days, and it was very well done and very well executed. It did not involve anything in the wilderness. There was no survival skills required.
No,
And
think the point that you were making also comes down to something very, very specific. Now, I call it culture by choice, productivity by design, because to Catherine's point, a culture is going to organically occur. What I think we sometimes need reminders of is that every single decision and every single action that we take, both as formal leaders and sometimes as leaders because we're the person people look to or that kind of thing, every single one of those things either reinforces the things you want to have as strong themes in your culture or fractures it a little bit. And maybe a little bit more the next day, and maybe a little bit more when somebody who saw you do that and they don't think past, oh, I think that Stephen's so cool and he did that, so that must be the way that I need to go forward. And they don't think past that to, well, that wasn't the best version of Steve I've ever seen, and it didn't look like he was having a great day. Maybe that isn't something I want to take forward. That level of thought doesn't always seem to be occurring at the level of frequency I'd like to see anyway. And
I was thinking,
proponent of critical thinking. So
I was going to mention something, but I know Jonathan, are we back on your chosen path before I?
Well, we always like to go where the conversation takes us, but the question we really started with was when we hear these stories of activities that it's hard to define or describe as anything other than boneheaded. How does it happen? Where is the breakdown? I mean, I firmly believe that culture is top down. The leader sets the tone. And as you said, Steve, either you create it or you allow it to happen. And then there's kind of a biofeedback that kicks in. But to not be able to project, to see, at least ask the question, right? Is this an idea that might not work the way we want it to?
One of my favorite
does it.
One of my favorite questions as a coach when, we're talking through a decision and, my client has a path they've chosen. One of my questions is, what message do you send when you make this decision? And what message do you send if you make this other decision? And which one supports the vision that you have for your company? And we start with, what is your vision in the very beginning? What is the vision for your life and what is the vision for your company? Because when you talk about vision for your company, sometimes it divorces you from the life part, and then they get sucked into something that maybe they didn't anticipate. They had a dream, and the reality of how they live the reality of that vision in their life, and it doesn't enter the equation. So I think that pause, that moment where you sit back and say, okay, what happens when I do this or when I do that, that is a learned behavior. That is not a natural instinct unless you've grown up in an environment where you're always like, what's going to happen? How's
How could tank?
Yeah.
If this thing goes completely south,
Exactly.
And clearly the team that left their colleague out there either didn't think about it or I believe this to be worse, didn't care.
Right.
Well, you know, I read the article about this, and what it sounded like to me is that they were climbing a mountain. They were climbing a 14,000-foot mountain together, and one person was struggling. And they all reached the summit, and he hadn't gotten there yet. And so they went back down, and apparently they passed him on the way down and told him that he should finish on his own.
No, no one
Which he
can.
did, and
That's-
then got disoriented on the way back down.
Well, no,
So I could just visualize, you know, whoever's in charge of this thing is making this decision that, well, we're all going to summit, and you need to summit because you're part of the group, and we'll meet you down at the bottom. And everybody else is passively accepting the person who's taken on this leadership role or has been given this leadership role. And nobody thinks to speak up saying, maybe that's not a good idea.
There's not a chance in a million years that would happen. I might want safety first. That has to be a core value.
Or maybe I'll go back up with him.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly what I would do. There's no way we're letting anyone in a 14,000-foot, if they have their cardiac arrest or something happens, they die and freeze it. There's no way in God's green earth you can do that. Yeah.
there's a
Exactly.
reason there's a buddy system for crying out
Yeah,
loud.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Be like open water swimming.
Yeah.
You know,
So
I mean,
I-
that's why you don't go surfing by yourself unless you know a group of people out there, because it's just people die. You can die doing stuff like that. So
I
anyway.
think one of the things that I find interesting is as you describe that scenario, Jonathan, there is a component that was clearly missing and it's psychological safety, which
Yeah.
would have said that regardless of who was the assigned or de facto leader,
Mhm.
somebody would have who felt, oh gosh, that's just because you should have seen the look on your face, Steve, when he was talking about it. It's like,
And I'm like, oh my God.
You
Yeah,
know,
like, what are you
but
thinking?
the person who went what inside their own head with enough psychological safety would have said, whoa, are you sure
Yeah.
that that's a good idea? This is, after all, a team building exercise, and he's part of our team.
Yeah.
You know, but
Great.
clearly that was missing to begin with.
Empathy.
And you end up with the diffusion of responsibility. My neighbor's lawn guys just showed up, so I hope that's not too distracting. But you know, it's that herd mentality. You know, I always think about this because I've experienced it so many times. We're walking down the street, and there's somebody else coming the direction coming right at you. And what happens? You each step out of the way to avoid each other. But if you're walking down the street and there are 4 people walking abreast, chances are none of them will move out of the way. Because-
That's when you develop very pointed elbows. Excuse me.
Well, yes, but it shouldn't need to come to that.
No,
Right?
it
There's a sense of, well, you know, I'm not blocking the sidewalk. There's plenty of room for other people, but I'm part of, right? It's the poster I love. It says, no raindrop thinks it's responsible for the flood.
Oh, I
And
love that.
you
That's
get
a
into
good
this
one.
herd mentality, and especially when someone takes charge. Well, if there's something wrong with his decision, then somebody else would be speaking up, and everybody else is thinking the same thing.
You know, you're making good. Everyone just made really psychological safety. I think about intentionality. Going back to that again. Ultimately, whether it's in the, Catherine, you're talking about that, and I was just thinking about, as we raise our families, we have to be more intentional about how and what we want to impart in terms of values to our kids, because technology is not a way to outsource parenting. And certainly you can see the challenge that the current generation has, because it is incredibly addictive to have these technologies, because they do help us in marvelous ways. But if people are not getting and imparted those values, those core values of psychological safety, team first, doing the right thing, stepping aside, being gracious, what polite looks like, listening from possibility as opposed to just, random interrupting people. And so there's something there, and so Catherine, to your point, I guess we have to be more mindful that not everyone's going to raise their kids with intentionality. And if they go through college and have their phones on and they don't perhaps learn these life skills and they show up in the workplace, it's very possible that learning things like empathy and collaboration just may not be a life skill that they learned, unfortunately. So
Exactly.
it does mean that leadership in companies need to be much more aware about what they're doing. So, Jonathan, what you said is, yeah, it's possible that a small group of people working, someone decided, well, this is a really cool idea, and they didn't have the same life skills that all of us on this phone had. And so they did some random crazy things because they thought that was cool and didn't realize what the negative consequences would be of doing some of those crazy things. So
With no consultation.
yeah. And so I think that's right. So I think Catherine kind of, when you said that earlier, I was thinking about it and I thought, oh yeah, I could see that in some of my former employees, but they just didn't have those life skills. And I'm like, how did they not learn that? And then you were thinking, well, yeah, obviously because they had other ways that they learned, and those other ways that they learned didn't involve icebreakers and overcoming, doing things like, using your words as a child, right? Which is great. We use your words, something. So there's something there. So there's, yeah.
One of the best books that I never finished, and I almost always finish books, but I've still not finished this one, was written by Rabbi Edwin Friedman. No relationship to Thomas, I understand. And it was called A Failure of Nerve. And it was about the crisis of leadership. And the point that the rabbi made was that if you truly wanted to understand the problems that a person is having with navigating through their relationships with other people, then you need to understand the very first organization they ever belonged to. Catherine, Steve, they're
Really interesting. The very
I'm
first.
gonna have to look that
So
one
you
up.
mean literally? You mean like when they were a child, or
because your family is
your
the
family
first
navigation
organization you've ever been a
Mhm.
part of. You understand the dynamics, you understand the power flow. Everybody knows when they can go to mom versus maybe dad, or in some cases, mom number two. Being a third parent actually gave my stepchildren a kind of an interesting dynamic to work with. So it took me 2 years to figure out they were plotting the power lines. I thought, God, am I stupid or something?
I love it.
That's where you learn everything. And at one point, I turned to Michael and I said, I blame you and Allison's mother. And he said, for what? I said, he's no idea it's appropriate to say thank you.
oh yeah, oh boy, yeah,
It's a good-hearted person. She's a lovely person. She's very, very smart, very, very hardworking. And it just always threw me off. And I realized there's a difference though. They believe that a demonstration of gratitude was such that you never actually had to say thank you. And I had to work to get to that.
Oh, interesting. And I grew up with
yeah.
in Hawaii, everyone says thank you, right? Aloha, thank you, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Well,
the same is true of forgiveness in a
Yeah.
family.
Mm-hmm.
And we're navigating that in my life these days. And it is a family that swept things under the rug versus a family who, hat in hand apologized and then allowed the other and asked for forgiveness and allowed the other person then to forgive you, as opposed to sorry, in the road.
Interesting. No,
And
That's a
that
real thing.
dynamic is really important for, relationship. And it's also really important for mutual healing, because when you offend someone and it causes a rift, it's hurtful on both sides, not just one.
Yeah, and also vulnerability, right? The
Mhm.
ability to be
Yeah.
vulnerable. I always, say,
Key.
yeah, vulnerability is my superpower. So I really do. I believe that, because I have no problem being vulnerable. And so, and I tell all of the leaders in my group, vulnerability is a superpower, because if you can be vulnerable, then the people will follow you, because they, the absence of ego goes a long way.
Yes, humility is that strength.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
this is why my character is inseparable from successful leadership,
Oh,
because we lead by example, and you could fake things for a while, but people are going to see through you sooner or later. But I think it's a nice place to wrap up, because it takes us even more than full circle, because before we started recording, we were talking about this conversation from Simon Sinek from a number of years ago, where he said basically the same thing. He says that young people didn't have parents parenting, they didn't have teachers teaching, and now by default, it's up to bosses. Leaders have to be parents. Leaders have to create a sense of family, because that's really the only hope for a successful culture. And if they abdicate that responsibility, there's absolutely nobody to step forward and pick up that slack.
Yeah. I mean,
No, nature abhors a vacuum. Somebody will fill the void. The question is willing to live with
yeah,
what
that's true.
will happen.
Yeah, well, history has plenty of unpleasant examples of that happening. But thank you. Steve Smith, glad to have you for your first time. Catherine Fitzgerald.
I enjoyed it immensely.
Hirotsu Ziemski. Always delighted to have you back. Look forward to the next time. If you would like to, if you're listening or watching and you would like to hear the backstage conversation that will continue, that's available to paid, or let's call them premium members. Go to my Substack and you can look into that. If you have a topic you'd like us to take up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com, use the contact information, submit your idea. If it's compelling, we will use it for a future episode. And as always, we encourage you to continue grappling with the gray.